Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wading into some very deep and very British waters. The concept of free speech. Now, if you're like most people, you probably have a pretty settled idea of what free speech means here in the UK. It feels, well, it feels ingrained.
Oh, absolutely.
We hear it all the time, things like, we invented free speech, or this idea that it's some ancient, untouchable right. The general feeling is, I can say what I want as long as I'm not calling for violence.
And that deep-seated cultural certainty is precisely what the sources force us to scrutinize today. That assumption that it's an absolute right is the core conflict we have to unpack.
So what's our mission here?
Our mission is to look directly at the legal sources, at the actual law, and see how it governs speech, and to show why there's this massive gap between that cultural confidence and the legal reality.
Okay, let's do it. Let's move past that feeling of historical confidence and look at the actual domestic legal framework. So where do we even begin, legally speaking? I mean, we don't have a single codified constitution.
No, we don't. And that's the first big difference you have to grasp, especially when you compare us to, say, the U.S. We have no single founding document that just guarantees free speech.
So where does the right come from?
It's derived from a mosaic, a kind of patchwork of common law, specific statutes, and most crucially in the modern era, international treaties we've brought into our own law.
So no First Amendment, but we have something that does the job today.
Exactly. The closest and frankly the strongest legal guarantee we have is Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, 1998. We just call it the HRA.
Right.
And that act is what brought the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, into UK law. Article 10 is the bit that protects your right to hold opinions and, to share information and ideas.
Which sounds great. On the surface, that sounds pretty absolute.
Yeah.
But this is the point the sources really hammer home, and it's critical. Article 10 is described as a qualified right.
Yes.
What does that mean in practice?
That one word, qualified, is everything. It's the whole structural difference. It means it is not a blank check. The law explicitly says that your right to expression can be restricted by the state. But, and this is key, only if that restriction is prescribed by law, if it's for a legitimate aim, and if it's deemed necessary in a democratic society.
Necessary in a democratic society. I mean, that's a huge, elastic phrase. That sounds like it needs a lot of interpretation.
It absolutely does, and that's its job. It means that courts and public authorities they're mandated to, constantly balance your right to free speech against a whole list of other things.
Such as?
National security, public safety, preventing crime, protecting public health or morals, and, this is a big one, protecting the reputation and rights of others.
So the test isn't just, did you call for violence? It's much broader. It's, is your speech unfairly damaging someone's reputation or their right to privacy?
Precisely. The whole UK system is geared towards that balancing act. It's why our defamation laws, for example, are so different from America's. Here, the balance is struck much closer to protecting the individual's reputation. The right to criticize is qualified by my right not to be unfairly harmed.
And that qualified nature is so relevant. And the sources point out this huge political irony around the HRA itself.
The irony is stark, isn't it? The HRA 1998 gives us the most robust, structured legal protection for free speech the UK has ever had.
It's our strongest guarantee.
Yes. And yet, because of all the political opposition to the ECHR framework, it's the very act that many people who argue for absolute free speech want to see weakened or even repealed. It's both the strongest protector and the biggest political target.
Which leaves us with a huge question. If the legal framework is so clearly about balance and qualification, why does that cultural confidence, that deep feeling that our speech is basically absolute, why does it persist so strongly?
It's because history and, national mythology do a lot of the heavy lifting in British public life. That historical pride creates this profound but maybe false sense of security.
Like the Mother of Parliament's idea.
Exactly. We invoke that, which suggests these protections are just sort of automatic. We feel like open debate is an inherited birthright, and so we look to our foundational documents for proof.
And the foundational document everyone points to, without fail, is the Magna Carta. It's treated as being almost synonymous with liberty and free speech.
It is. It's revered as the source code for all our freedoms. But this is where the sources deliver a major, an aha moment.
Okay.
Because the Magna Carta, while it was revolutionary for constitutional thought, it did not create a general right to free speech. Its job was fundamentally about protecting status and process, not individual expression.
Okay, let's put that under a microscope.
Yeah.
King John, 1215, Runnymede. We all know the story. But who was this document actually written to protect?
So the famous clauses protect the free men, and we really shouldn't romanticize that term. In 1215, free men were a very distinct, powerful minority.
We're not talking about the average person.
Not at all.
Yeah.
We're talking about adult men with property and legal status, the barons who were in rebellion, the gentry, landowners, powerful merchants, people with clout.
So if that was the minority, who was the excluded majority?
Well, by most estimates, at least half the population were villeins or serfs. Unfree peasants who were, tied to the land. They had almost no legal recourse. This document wasn't for them.
It's more like a high-level negotiation between the CEO and the board of directors, not a national Bill of Rights.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, it was written in Latin, which tells you who the audience was. And while it did protect widows from forced remarriage, which was an important economic protection, women generally did not share in the rights granted to free men.
So we know who it protected. What did it actually do? What was the scope of that protection?
It limited the king's power. It protected a free man from arbitrary imprisonment or from having his property unlawfully seized. The protection was procedural.
Procedural.
Yes, it was built around those famous clauses requiring lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. And it put limits on excessive fines.
And what about religion? I know there's a clause about the church.
There is, and it's often misunderstood. It guaranteed that the English church shall be free, but that was about protecting the church as an institution from the king's interference. It was a power struggle, a jurisdictional thing, not a charter for freedom of belief or conscience for individuals.
So the big takeaway here is property, status, and judicial process. It established the rule of law, the idea that the king wasn't above the rules, but it offered absolutely zero protection for political speech, for dissent, for anything we'd call freedom of expression today.
Exactly. It was a crisis document to redraw the lines of power. Its legacy is due process. We confuse that protection of process with the protection of speech because centuries later, lawyers built on that framework to argue for broader rights.
And speaking of later on, the story doesn't end in 1215. When we talk about Magna Carta in UK law, we're usually not even talking about the original version.
That's right. The original 1215 charter didn't last long at all. King John died in 1216, the country was in a civil war, and his heir, Henry III, was only 9 years old.
So what happened?
The Regency government reissued it in 1216 and 1217, basically as a political tool to try and end the war. They took out the most controversial bits, like Clause 61, which had basically authorized rebellion against the king.
Made it a bit more palatable.
Made it politically survivable, yes. The tone shifted from a revolutionary demand to a statement that the crown agrees to govern lawfully.
And then came the final, most important version.
The 1225 reissue. This is the one that really counts constitutionally. Henry III was ruling in his own right. He needed money for a war, and he reissued the Carta of our own free will in exchange for a big tax grant from the barons. That transaction is what cemented it as law. It's the version that entered the statute books.
But even through all those changes, the fundamental character stayed the same. It was still about due process, still for free men, and still
completely silent on any protection for the content of political speech or dissent. Its genius was creating the idea that power has to operate within rules. It laid the groundwork for constitutionalism, but it wasn't in itself the charter for free expression we sometimes pretend it was.
Okay, let's synthesize this. Let's pull together the two main findings from the sources. First, we've established that free speech in the UK today is a qualified, balanced right under the HRA 1998. It requires constant juggling with other interests.
Correct. And second, we've established that its perceived historical foundation, the Magna Carta, was fundamentally a document about property, status, and process for a select minority, not freedom of expression for everyone.
Right.
And we'd really encourage you to reflect on this. How does understanding that legal reality that speech is conditional change your perspective? When you see courts restricting a protest or acting on hate speech, they aren't violating some untouchable absolute. They are doing the complex balancing act that Article 10 explicitly tells them to do.
It changes the whole debate. It moves from, I can say what I want, to a much more difficult question. Where should that legally mandated balance point be in this specific case?
Exactly.
That structural perspective is invaluable. So here's the final provocative thought from the sources, building on everything we've just discussed.
Hmm.
If that foundational confidence in absolute free speech didn't come from the Magna Carta, and if our strongest legal protection today is actually a qualified right from an international treaty, where does that deep British certainty really come from? And if the HRA were ever weakened or repealed, what would a dedicated British First Amendment even look like? Would an absolute right even be compatible with a system built on parliamentary sovereignty? Something to chew on.